Reason and unreason. A law that is common to all universes, not just the physical universe in which we live, this is that all postulates limit the possible and thereby define the reasonable. Now that should be written up in letters of fire. Maybe if you can't write it in letters of fire, you should write it up on a postcard and pin it up on your study room wall. All postulates limit the possible and thereby define the reasonable. Once you understand that proposition, you understand an awful lot about universes. You understand that until a postulate is made, everything is possible. That any postulate, no matter what it is, limits the possible. For example, if a person says, "Alright, well, now the law is that no car will travel at more than 80 kilometers an hour on this stretch of road." Well, that's the law. Well, how does that limit the possible? Well, it limits the speed of the cars on that stretch of road, you see? I can make another example. Maybe you make a postulate and say, "Well, I'll go to Paris this weekend." Well, how does that limit the possible? If you go to Paris, you're not going to go anywhere else which is not Paris, are you? You see? So you limited your options, as they say, or you limited your possibilities. And no matter what postulate you make, you'll find that any postulate that you make will limit the possible. So the first thing about a postulate is, any postulate limits the possible. That's its fundamental purpose, to limit the possible. Now how about this second bit, and thereby defines the reasonable? Now that is really something. The subject of what is reasonable in this universe is a terrible puzzle. It's a great puzzle. People bang the table and say, "Well, this is reasonable and that is unreasonable." And they talk about what is reasonable and what is unreasonable, but if you say to them, "What is reason and what is unreasonable and what is reasonable?" they can't define the terms. They'll give you an example of something they consider as reasonable, and they'll give you an example of what they consider as unreasonable, but they cannot define reasonableness, unreasonableness, or reason itself. They simply cannot define them. If you were to talk to a physicist, you could get closer to a definition of reason. If you were to talk to a logician, you'd get even closer to a definition of reason, because logic is the science of reason, but even the logicians don't grasp this fundamental relationship between postulates and reason. I think most of them would if you were to give it to them. They'd say, "Oh, yes, I sort of knew it, but I didn't know it in those words." But the average person simply doesn't understand the subject of reason. He doesn't understand what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. Although he'll give you endless examples of what he considers reasonable and what he considers unreasonable. So all postulates limit the possible and thereby define the reasonable. Now, how does a postulate define the reasonable? Well, this is the way it goes. That which is reasonable is that which is consistent with the postulate. It's really as simple as that. I'll give it to you again. That which is reasonable is that which is consistent with the postulate. Example, if the postulate is that every house in Australia will have a roof on it. In other words, if a law says that no house shall be sold without a roof, all houses would have a roof. Then it's reasonable if you buy a house to expect the house to have a roof on it, because it's consistent with the postulate, which is that all houses in Australia will have a roof on them. See that? And if you were to buy a house and you look up and notice that it hadn't got a roof on it, that would be inconsistent with the postulate, which says that all houses will have a roof on them, and so you could say, "Well, this is unreasonable. I shouldn't have expected to buy a house without a roof on it." You follow? So that's the connection between reason and the postulate, and there's no other senior definition of reason in this universe. Reason is only that which is consistent with a postulate. That is to say that in the absence of postulates, the concept of reason is meaningless. In the absence of postulates, the concept of reason is meaningless. The concept of reason only has meaning in the presence of postulates, and that which is reasonable is that which is consistent with a postulate. In other words, the postulate defines what is reasonable. It defines it because that which is reasonable is that which is consistent with the postulate. So there's nothing difficult about this. It's very simple. It's so simple, this is so simple, that you almost have to make it more complicated in order to understand it. It's so terribly simple, but life gets so involved in this subject of what is reasonable and what is unreasonable that it forgets the basics and forgets the simplicities, and so you come up to a person and say, "Well, what is reasonable? What is unreasonable? What is the definition of reason?" I don't know how many people you can walk up to and say, "What's a good definition of reason?" I don't know how many people will say, "All postulates limit the possible and thereby define the reasonable." And that which is reasonable is that which is consistent with a postulate. You know. You might find somebody else who would say that, but I think it is very doubtful indeed. I'll tell you what, I wouldn't have said it until I got the basic postulate of this universe out, and so forth. I wouldn't have answered that. I didn't know what reason was either. I was just like anyone else. I couldn't relate it to postulates. If you can't relate it to postulates, you can't relate it to anything, because the subject of reason won't relate to anything else. Now, can we actually get more precise on the definition of reason than to say that reason is that which is consistent with a postulate? Yes, we can. We can go one little step further, and we can define reason as a complementary postulate. Reason is a complementary postulate. Now, how did that come about? Well, that which is most consistent with a postulate is its complementary postulate, you see? You can't get more consistent with a postulate than the complementary postulate to that postulate. So the complementary postulate must be the very essence of reason regarding a postulate. In other words, a person wants to be known, say, he's operating on the to be known postulate. The most reasonable thing you can do regarding that person is to know him. You see that? That's the most reasonable thing because that is the absolute essence of, the totality of the consistency. That is as consistent as you can get with his postulate. His postulate is to be known, and if you adopt a to know postulate which is the complementary postulate of to be known, then you will be as reasonable as you can get. You will be as consistent as you can get with his postulate. So reason is a complementary postulate in this universe, and that is the most precise definition there is in this universe of reason. It is a complementary postulate. This tells you immediately that the opposition postulate is as unreasonable as you can get. A person has the postulate to be known, and about as unreasonable as you can be is to not know him, because it's totally inconsistent with his postulate. His postulate is to be known, and you're directing a to not know postulate towards him. Well, you couldn't get any more inconsistent with his postulate than that. And you couldn't get more unreasonable as far as he's concerned than that. You follow? Now, this definition of reason being a complementary postulate tells you immediately that all games, because they contain conflicting postulates, must be unreasonable. A game is a contest in conviction, and contains opposing postulates by definition. That is the definition of a game. It's a contest in conviction. There are two people trying to convince each other of opposing postulates. So all games must be unreasonable, follow? It drops out straight away from the datum that reason is a complementary postulate. If reason is a complementary postulate, then all games are unreasonable. There's no reason in conflict, it's an unreasonable activity. See, it's an unreasonable activity. I mean, it might be fun, games might be fun, but so help me they're not reasonable. I mean, you've got 22 men in two football teams standing on a football field, and they are about to start a game of football. It's not reasonable for them to play this game of football. The reasonable thing to do, if they want to be reasonable at all about it, is at the beginning of the game one of the men to pick up the ball and run it down and put it in the opposing goal. You see that? If the idea is to get the ball into the goal between those two posts, well, they might as well pick it up, run it down, and put it down there, if that's their purpose. It's not reasonable for 11 of them to try and get that ball into the goal and the other 11 to try and stop it from happening. That is not reasonable. It is not a reasonable activity. It might be a lot of fun, but it's certainly not reasonable. See that? So that's just an example of an unreasonable game. Well, it's no more unreasonable than any other game. The fact that the conflict is there, the fact that the postulates are opposing each other, is the very essence of unreason, because reason is a complementary postulate. Then this tells you right away that when a person comes up to you and says, "What we need in our society is more conflict and more competition and so on," that they're also saying that we need more and more unreason. You see that? The conflict, the competition, and so on, and the opposition all produce unreason. The more conflict there is, the less reason there is, and so on. A tremendous amount of data starts to make sense once you understand these basics. All drops out of this hamper if all postulates limit the possible and therefore define the reasonable, and the reasonable is a complementary postulate. Okay,